issues that Clausewitz raised in the quote I gave you earlier, the German theorists, was wars between civilized peoples versus wars with uncivilized peoples. Uncivilized people fight in different ways, and therefore we have a justification dealing with them in an uncivilized fashion. So, what examples can we think of? Well, uncivilized warfare would be this kind of guerrilla, from the Russian perspective, guerrilla warfare in Afghanistan. But another version of this this is more guerrilla than the uncivilized, are battles in which the basic structures of war break down, and a group of civilians take into their own hands an attack on some other group of civilians. So this is the case in the American Civil War of the Battle of Lawrence, Kansas, in which a southern group attacks this place and murders large numbers of people. The uncivilized warfare, with a large racist component, is the murder of black soldiers by Southern troops. So this is a very famous Fort Pillow massacre, when Southern troops confronted defeated a black battalion and cut the throats of the soldiers. A clear violation of the war, on the grounds that these are not the sort of people that we owe these kind of obligations to. And the next stage of that is the battles against Native Americans, who fought very differently from the way the whites fought. That is, taking scalps, for example, was a huge, if they take scalps, we can do anything to them. Right? And likewise, then in the African context, and we'll see this you see this week when we talk about imperial wars, these people were so strange, deluded, so wild, that of course one could treat them in any way that seemed appropriate, or any way that one wanted to treat them. So excessive force against these people, mistreating them in prisoner camps and so forth, was thought to be okay because we have a disproportion in the level of civilization. So we've gone now from this rules between belligerent countries to civil wars, to guerrilla wars, to wars with people outside of the pale of civilization. In each of these becomes progressively harder to legislate about and to control and to apply a moderation. Now, I don't know if it's the last stage of this, but the modern deal is how to deal with soldiers who are actually kids. So how do you feel about people who kill children? Well, they're soldiers, but they're kids. And so the jurisprudence now says having a child soldier is a violation of the rules of war. In other words, you can't put a child in this kind of danger. Consequently, the question of whether you kill them or not is another issue. But there's a great deal of this child soldier, as you know, in the world today. Children forced to fight in these wars all over different parts of the world. So the current issue really is the huge issue is how one deals with these stages of irregular warfare, which I talked to you about, dealing with people who are imagined to be very different or like in an earlier stage of European civilization when the Europeans too fought barbarously with each other. So, and the last version of this is sort of what you might call Hobbesian condition, wars without states or in failed or failing states. So when you think about the situation now in Somalia or in parts of the Sudan, you may have all read about Darfur, you have this sort of sense that these wars they're not actually guerrilla warfare, and they're not exactly civil warfare. They seem to be sort of the Hobbesian state of the war of all against all, in which international jurisprudence has had very little to say about its moderation because there's no state or juridical structure to moderate. Well, let me just the final point that I want to make: can these be moderated, and if so, how? There's some efforts to appeal to a warrior's honor, to make some of these soldiers act as if they were still reasonable. They were warriors with some obligations. That seems to be relatively ineffective. There's intervention based on international law, and this is particularly the 2005 responsibility to intervene, in which the international community, or some part of the international community, intervenes in a civil war situation in order to prevent what it takes to be violations. So this last Libyan case would be such a case, an internal war in which one side is doing something illegitimate to one of the sides, and the international community has a responsibility to step in. There's also an important area that goes back to the issue we talked about, boycotts and slavery, the notion of restricting funds to violators in these seemingly these situations beyond the reach of law. And there's an example I would cite to you, for example, the certified diamond movement. So in other words, if you buy diamonds in most places now, the diamonds will become certified. These are not blood diamonds, which is to say these were not diamonds produced in certain parts of the Congo in which warlords are supposedly getting money from these diamonds in order to fund these illegitimate contests which violate the rules of war and the rights of civilians. So in that sense, there's the economic boycott to prevent these kinds of, to regulate in some sense these kinds of wars. I don't want to speak right now about the rules of political engagement, but the other big thing we'll have that we're going to come back to later in the course several times is post hoc trials. In other words, there's some hope that these situations can be moderated by the fear on the part of perpetrators that they will be tried. So there's been a series of international trials, the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, East Timor are the most prominent cases of late. Whether this is effective or not, we wait to be seen. So what I've hoped to do, and one more thing, Lars is very kindly agreed to let me ask him some questions about his Afghan experience. But Iraq experience. I'm sorry. Now on the border, right, between. Yeah. But we just in a second. So what I've tried to suggest to you today, then, is or at least open to introduce you to, is a whole arena of international law, which seeks to divide up the combatants from civilians, and to do two things: to one, restrict what combatants can do to civilians, and also to moderate what combatants can do to each other. I try to suggest to you this was not, so to speak, a no-brainer. This was not obvious because much of our, now thinking of the Western tradition, but I think we could do this in every tradition, it was not that these people have any rights. So that's why I cited to you Deuteronomy and Greek texts. I suggested to you then in the world of growing armies, rules were produced to discipline armies, and by the late 18th and early 19th century, to moderate the relation of armies to civilian populations. Further, for some national law, and then an international law. And then I tried to say, well, this does actually set a standard which armies of states do try to meet. There's a huge area of its collapse, which is when states, belligerent armies with people in uniform, after all, uniform designates someone who's in combat. That's how you tell them apart. When it's not fought like that, and when there's a breakdown of these. And the further this breakdown happens, the more difficult it is to apply in some reasonable way these rules of war, until one reaches the kind of Hobbesian state in which there's very little to do except try to starve, and this time to starve the perpetrators of the funds needed to these weapons. So that's what I have to say today. Now, at coffee the other day, I had a really interesting. Some of you were here, but we had a very interesting discussion with one of your colleagues Lars Taylor, who's had one tour of duty in Iraq and is going back to Afghanistan on the Iraq, in